Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the second session of the day. We're really excited to have such great speakers this morning talking about cities and planning, something that I know lots of you are very interested in and are doing really important work on. And this morning, we're going to be talking to Tim Gill. The session's called Urban Playground, How Child-Friendly Planning and Design Can Save Cities. We first came across Tim through Amy Martin, who's our Radical Childcare Lead and at Civic Square, and came to know of Tim's book that's going to be launched soon, which I'm sure you're going to talk about yourself, Tim. But also, we're just for a long time have been really inspired and excited by this kind of work. So those of you who've been at Civic Square or Impact Hub when we were will know that we've talked to lots and lots of different people thinking about this work and this challenge. And so it's really lovely to have Tim with us today. So Tim's going to be exploring, what does a true child-friendly city look like? How does children's play fit into the picture and their mobility? And why should we even worry about looking at cities through the eyes of children? In answering these questions, Tim will set out key ingredients of a child-friendly city and the reasons why decision makers around the world have embraced the idea, drawing on over 20 years of research and advocacy, including study visits to cities in Europe, North and South America. And he will highlight the questions that need tackling if we are to transform cities into inclusive, equitable, livable, sustainable places that are fit for the post-pandemic challenges of the 21st century. Sounds very exciting, doesn't it? Tim's a global advocate for children's outdoor play, and you can find him on Tim R. Gill. At some point during the talk, Tim's going to ask you questions, as well as you can ask your questions for him. A reminder, if you just go onto the stage tab of the chat and answer there. And he's also going to do a live poll, which you might just want to locate, is in the top right-hand side of your screen under the tab polls, just so you know where you're going when that time comes. But for now, I'm going to head into the background. I'm very, very excited to welcome Tim to the stage. I hope you enjoy and you're sitting back and relaxing on this. It's quite sunny here, sunny Saturday morning in Birmingham. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you very much, Imi. And it's great to be here. It's sunny here in London. And I'm looking forward to this conversation. And I'm going to start by inviting you to think about your own childhoods. I think when we're thinking about children's lives in the city and in the neighborhoods where we live, it's good to remind ourselves of some of the qualities of our own childhood. So this is the poll that's coming up. So Chris, I'm hoping you're ready to do this. I'm going to ask you to, first of all, think about the kind of places you used to play when you were a child, and picture in your mind one place that you would say was your favorite place to play, and just have that picture in your mind as I speak. And then the poll is going to ask you two questions. So Chris, if we could put the questions up. The first question is they're both questions about that place, the place that's pictured in your mind. And the first question is, was that place somewhere that was outside? Was it out of doors? And the second question is, was that place somewhere that was directly supervised by adults? So we're going to give you a few seconds, 10 or 15 seconds maybe, to answer those two questions. Just to remind you, I'm just going to see if they have appeared. It looks like they have. Was your favorite place to play as a child indoors or outdoors? And was it supervised by adults or not? And I'm going to just ponder how I'm going to hear the results of that. I've just realized.
Tim, I will. I'll speak them to you in a second.
Perfect. Excellent. And does it look like people are applying?
I'll just check now. And guys, just I'll come back on screen for a moment. Just to remind you that the tab is at the top and it's called polls. And I'm just going to answer myself so I can see the answers coming through.
And I'm going to do the same. Okay, I think we've got about 28, 30 votes. I'm
Yeah.
going to stick my neck out and say there's a fairly clear pattern emerging.
Yeah.
And I'm also going to confess that this is not the first time I've asked these two questions. So those of you who are following the poll, what you can see is the vast majority of us, when we think about the places that are most resonant to us from our own childhoods, they're places that were out of doors and more or less out of sight of adults. They're places where we could feel a sense of possibility, where we could feel that we were kind of in charge of our own destinies, even if just for a few minutes or an hour or two, and where, where the anxieties and concerns and agendas of adults faded into the background. And I make no apology for evoking these images. This is not mere nostalgia. What I'm doing here is reminding us grown-ups of what I think of as a vital ingredient of a healthy childhood, that there are some spaces and times in children's lives where they can have a taste of freedom. And we know that experience is disappearing from the lives of children today. And that's really the starting point for a lot of my work on children and cities and play. So I'm going to just get my slide deck up and running, and we'll start exploring that in a bit more detail. Here we go. So just picking up on that little exercise in personal history, I want to share with you my next slide, which shows you how what you might call the right to roam of children has been shrinking. So you're looking at a map, and what you can see in this map is what you might call the roaming range, or the home territory of 4 children at the age of 8 years old, but they happen to be in 4 generations of the same family who all lived in the same city. So this big blob that you can see that takes up most of the map, that's the home territory or the roaming range of the great-grandfather in this family at the age of 8. So he could travel 6 miles, 10 kilometers across the city on his own. And then you can see this is the same kind of map for the 8-year-old grandfather in this family, and then the mother. And the dot here that you can see at the top left, that's the roaming range of the son in this family. At the age of 8, he's actually allowed to go to the end of his street. And in fact, we know from wider studies that that's more license, that's more of a right to roam than most 8-year-old children get. Most children today in the UK and in many other countries are effectively confined to their homes and gardens if they have them. So what you're seeing is what I call the shrinking horizons of childhood. And I think it's one of the most important and one of the most underexplored changes in the nature of childhood. And as I've hinted, it's happening for boys and girls, children from all ethnic groups all around the world, even in low and middle income countries. So now I haven't got time to go into why this is happening, but I will say that I think it's a problem. I think that children are losing out because of this change, and I think that society is losing out. And I think that the built environment, planning and design has a big part to play in this. So I'm going to say a little bit more about the history and context of childhood. I'm going to then talk about what I mean by child-friendly planning and design, why I think it matters, and how we can make it happen, especially as we emerge through and out of the pandemic. So the next image you can see is of a street in New York City just at the turn of the last century, around 1900. Now, it's a way of reminding us that streets have historically been teeming with life and been places of trade and leisure and social contact for all ages throughout history. And you can see children and older people in the mixed in that image. So it's only been in really the last 120 years that even the idea that children should be corralled and removed and, as it were, made invisible in the city or given their own special places, that idea has emerged. But it's even within urban planning, you see expressions that children do deserve a place and acclaim in the city. And one of the most remarkable examples of that was the work of Aldo van Eyck, the Dutch modernist architect, who spent 20 years in the post-war rubble of Amsterdam, creating this fine-grained, carefully designed network of, I mean, they're often called playgrounds. They're not just playgrounds. They're sociable community hubs for public spaces for families to come and gather and for children to play. It's a remarkable program. And we even see this vision of supporting and acknowledging children's claim on public space and on the city in work in going into the 70s. This is the Biker estate and Erskine's work in Newcastle, where if you look, and there's some fascinating studies of this estate, of incredible energy and thought and resources being devoted to making this new patch of the city work well for children. But I think the 70s probably marked the beginning of the end as far as planning and urban design attention on children. And so the next slide that you'll see gives a rather more depressing but familiar take on what, you know, children's right to the city is, how that is expressed and acknowledged. I should say the image is from Aileen Shackle. It is certainly not one of Aileen's designs. She's a very talented and acclaimed designer of play space. But what I think this image does give you a sense of is just how wrong we've been going, just how badly we've been framing and thinking about children in public space and in cities. So I'm going to switch to a more positive take now and offer you a quote that is quite familiar within those of us who are advocating for a more thoughtful approach to children's cities. It's from the former mayor of Bogota, and I think the quote, I take it quite literally, that it is a sign of the health of a neighborhood or a city that you see children of different ages, with and without their parents, active and visible in the city, in the same way that if you see salmon swimming up a river, then that's a sign of the health of that habitat. So I take this vision, and I'm offering you now with my next slide the absolute building blocks of a child-friendly city or child-friendly neighborhood. And it's a framework that has 2 dimensions. And this little diagram shows the 2 dimensions. So for a city or a neighborhood to be child-friendly, it needs to have 2 qualities in abundance. The first is fairly obvious: things to do. Neighborhoods that have nice green space, that have playgrounds, have nature, leisure activities, social space are great. But that's not enough on its own if children are not able to get around these neighborhoods and cities as well. So this is the other axis, children's mobility. How easy is it for children to get around the neighborhood, crucially on their own? And it's only when you have both lots of things to do, a lot of offers, and it's easy to get around, that you're here in this quadrant and you have a child-friendly city. So that's my conceptual framework, my definition of a child-friendly city. Now, it's linked with ideas of freedom, and you can see, and I think one of the interesting debates that's emerging around children's right to play and right to roam is that, you know, it's a kind of, it's a nice to have, or maybe it's becoming a concern for a certain subsection of the privileged. And this is an article that got some traction a few years ago. But actually, if you read that article, I think this is what the author is saying, that there are, of course, problems, and we're familiar with them, those of us who are paying attention to the Black Lives Matter movement, that Black people, people of color around the world are finding their right to occupy and to move around public space is being denied or curtailed. But I don't think that's something that anybody of us should be relaxed about. And my vision, and I think actually the vision of this writer as well, is that we all have a claim for ourselves and for our children to be able to enjoy everyday freedoms in the city. So just to narrow things down a bit, if we think about what makes neighborhoods work well for families, there are really 3 building blocks. You have housing, if you don't have housing that works well for families, then no families are going to live in that neighborhood, or they're going to want to get out. You also need services, of course, schools, healthcare, childcare. But the third plank, the third leg, is what I'm really interested in, is the public realm. And because this is where children start to live their public lives. They get beyond the home and the institutions where they're otherwise spending their time. So this is my focus for the rest of my talk, the public realm. And I'm going to start by sharing I'll move on to share the work of one city that has put more resources, time, political and economic effort into becoming more child friendly than probably any other city on earth. And that's the city of Rotterdam. It's a really interesting case study. And in essence, the starting point for Rotterdam was back in 2006, when a national poll showed that Rotterdam was the worst city in the Netherlands to bring up a child. Now, especially in the Netherlands, that is not a league table that you want to be at the bottom of. And the city realized it had a real problem, not just an image problem, but an economic problem with any families who were leaving the city. So it created and resourced several child-friendly city programs. And I'm just going to give you a flavor of what it did. So here's one beautiful example of that framework that I just talked about being put into practice. So this is a neighborhood just outside the city center, a poorer, largely working class neighborhood where with local organizations, the municipality and local agencies work to create a kind of child-friendly network of public spaces, schoolyards being open outside of the school hours, community spaces, traffic calming measures, street greening measures that knitted together to allow to improve the neighborhood, to just make it greener and nicer and more pleasant, to open up spaces for play and recreation and sport, and to connect all that in a coherent way alongside services and programming. So it's a lovely example of a neighborhood-wide intervention. And by the way, we should remind ourselves that children don't really live in cities. Children live in neighborhoods. Children's urban lives are played out at the neighborhood level, and I'm sure you'll see those of you who heard Dan's talk earlier will see some points of contact with that. So here's an example of a schoolyard. This is actually an Islamic school in Rotterdam that got a natural makeover, and that is also open outside of school hours for the whole community to use. On the left here, you can see a move where a car park, which was underused, was converted into an expanded, playful square with some play facilities and play offers, but also simply a greener, pleasant, sociable place to spend time. And on the right, you can see a pop-up project in one of Rotterdam's most high-profile city centre squares, because some of the work that was going on in Rotterdam was at the city centre level as well. Now, I mentioned the driver for this being concerns about families leaving the city, and Rotterdam is an example. They make no apology for this being a form of state-sponsored gentrification. But gentrification has a very different meaning and a different implications in the Netherlands. You have very high levels of social housing in the Netherlands. The housing market works very differently to markets in many other countries. So a lot of the side effects of gentrification that are really problematic in many parts of the world, rising rents, families being pushed out, aren't happening in Rotterdam. It's just simply the mechanisms aren't there. So you are seeing families, especially more affluent families, moving into neighborhoods, but that is not happening at the expense of poorer families. And there's research that shows that. So from the point of view of the politicians, this is the result they wanted. So I'm now showing my next slide, which tries to pull together, I think, some of the key ingredients of a really child-friendly neighborhood. And the slide that you can see, and the image you can see, is based quite closely on the eco-suburb of Vauban in Freiburg in Germany. And any of you who've delved into sustainable urban planning will be familiar with Vauban. I've been lucky enough to visit Vauban and Freiburg a couple of times over the years. And it's really the way that this neighbourhood pulls together all of the key ingredients that clearly both expand offers to children and expand their mobility and freedoms. It's incredible. But I'm not going to talk to all of this slide, but I just want to really pull out one feature, which is that this is essentially a car-free neighbourhood. So the streets that you can see, they're accessible to vehicles, but vehicles are all parked in car parks. There are 3 car parks, in fact, in Vauban. And the only time vehicles come in and out is for essential pick up and drop off. So in effect, the whole of the space between the buildings is given over as public space, and much of it's playful and sociable. So that's what child-friendly planning looks like. And why does it matter? You can see some bullet points there. I'm not going to talk to all of those, but I do want to say, to start by saying, my model, my vision of a child-friendly city or neighbourhood is pretty much what children themselves tell us when we take the time to ask them. So here is a summary of the key views that children, no matter where we find them, tell us what they like and what they don't like about cities in terms of the built environment. And I hope you can see that those plus points and minus points there map very nicely onto the schema, the framework I've been talking about around places to have fun and to meet, and also freedom of movement and lack of traffic. So the next reason and a strong driver is the link between child-friendly neighbourhoods and health and well-being. And it makes me sad to share this slide, but this is a development that we should be watching. This you're seeing an image of Ellie Kissy Deborah, who 6 years ago died in South London of lung problems, and there is a process going on right now into the cause of her death, and it may well be that she will be the first child in the UK for whom air pollution will be the stated cause of death. So why this matters is that we've got a direct health impact of bad planning. Ella and her family lived right by the South Circular in London, terrible levels of air pollution, a direct impact between urban planning and child mortality, it's a scandal, but it could be the catalyst for a profound change in the way we think about health in cities. But if we think about what young people are saying right now about the planet, then I think, again, we can see points of contact, and the voices of young people clearly calling for action and for change. And if we ask ourselves, what does a sustainable city look like? What does a green neighbourhood look like? It's compact. It's easy to walk and cycle around. There's lots of green space. Then a sustainable city, a sustainable neighbourhood looks like a child-friendly city or neighbourhood. So by thinking through our need to change cities to respond to the climate crisis, bringing a children's lens to that helps to join the dots between child-friendliness and sustainability. And the final point I want to make in favour of seeing cities from the eyes of children is really about some of the more fundamental problems that we're facing in society, and crucially problems around capitalism. And I was lucky enough to hear Professor Henderson speak a few weeks back, who's a leading, really a kind of business thinker about how capitalism needs to change. And one of the quotes that leapt out at me from her talk was the one you can see here, which is that right now, capitalism and economic decisions focus on the me and focus on the now, when what we really need is a focus on the us and on the later. And so why am I talking about this? I'm talking about this because if we bring children's voices and views into our debates about capitalism or about the city, it cannot help but shift our focus away from me and my narrow self-interest and thinking more collectively. And it cannot help but make us think more about the future and the long term. So I was lucky enough, as Imi mentioned, to spend some time traveling and visiting cities in different parts of the world to look at, and these are cities that have really been at the forefront of child-friendly planning. I'm not going to run through all of them, but just to say there's a range of cities in low and middle income as well as high income countries, and a range of sizes. And I focused on the municipal level. And I know there's lots of people in these debates, and I suspect in this audience, who are coming from outside of local authorities, but I do think municipalities have a key leadership role, and this is why I wanted to pick up on the municipalities that had been at the forefront of this movement. And so 2 images here on the left, you can see some work in a favela in Recife, a large city on the northeast of Brazil, where the mayor has become a champion of transforming neighborhoods to make them work better for children. And on the right is a square in Tirana in Albania, a city that's had unbelievable political and, of course, geological challenges with recent earthquakes and now the challenge of the pandemic, but is bringing children's views and concerns into the picture as a way of framing public debate about how that city needs to change. So I pulled all this together in the book that Imi mentioned, same title as this talk, Urban Playground, How Child-Friendly Planning and Design Can Save Cities, which is coming out in February. And in that book, I offer, I suppose, the arguments and also some recipes and ways forward. And one of the things that I wanted to bring out in the book is that cities actually come with different rationales. The cities that I was looking at, and you can see them all in this diagram, had different drivers. Some of them, like Rotterdam, were interested in their economies. Some were interested in community and sustainability, and you can see that group as well. Some were indeed focused on children's rights and well-being, and maybe in the formal sense of taking forward work based on the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, or more broadly on children's health. But what this diagram is showing is that most of the cities, and I think particularly the cities that were at the really putting resources and making a sizable difference, were cities that had more than one reason, that were looking for win-wins, for links between their long-term economy and their demographic shape and children, or links between sustainability and children, because that's when you start to see multiplier effects. So looking at the cities that I visited, realized that there were 4 building blocks, literal chunks of the public realm that were the focus of the work that was going on: streets, walking cycling networks, public space, and housing. And that where cities were having the biggest impact, they were having carrying out work at those 4 levels. And the next thing I realized was that there are 9 principles that I think would drive and shape an effective child-friendly initiative in a municipality. Now, I'm not going to run through all of those. This is the worst slide on my deck, so I'm not going to read through them either, but I do want to highlight 2 that I think are worth dwelling on right now. The first is around embracing and addressing diversity, equality, and inclusion. And then the second is about opportunism. So it's worth reminding ourselves, and we know this, that different ethnic groups do not have equitable share in public space. And that's true wherever you see divided communities and countries. So you're looking here at, this is actually, if you like, a kind of a before and after image of one of the most woeful play spaces I've visited in my life, which is in Newham. And you can see, even when it was first built 12, 13 years ago, it was pretty grim. And it's almost reverted to nature. And I think that it is not a coincidence that places like these are being built in some of the most diverse parts of the country. And this is, as I said, Newham, the most diverse local authority in London, if not the country. But on a more positive note, you can see that some cities, and this is a slide from Paris, are making their vision for the public space, for the public realm, centrally tied with the idea of child friendliness. And this is coming to some of the other ideas that Dan Hill was talking about earlier, and Imi was bringing up, of the 15 neighborhood, a 15-minute neighborhood concept in Mayor Anne Hidalgo's new vision for the city of Paris. And I think that's an incredibly powerful unifying vision that can address spatial justice, equity, sustainability, and livability. So we now find ourselves in a rather different place from the world that we were all in when I started writing the book a year or so ago. So what does the pandemic and the experience of living through a pandemic mean? How does it change? How does it highlight the picture? And I guess one thing that has become clear is that streets and localities matter a great deal. We've all lived much more hyper-local lives than we used to. And as traffic levels fell, and as our need for public space and outdoor space and our need to get around locally grew, many cities have realized the value of opening up street space, that actually street space is wasted if it's just entirely given over to traffic. And this is an image from New York, but coming closer to home, and remarkably, just the next door borough to where I am, in Hackney, has announced that every primary school in Hackney is now going to have a school streets program. So this is where streets around the school are closed to traffic at the beginning and end of the school day, so that to promote walking and cycling, and as a happy side effect, to open up those spaces for social use. Again, in a different part of London, we're seeing the first, I think it's the first, or certainly one of the pilot low traffic neighborhoods. So this is taking a neighborhood level approach to taming traffic, enhancing streets for walking and cycling. And actually my own borough, Waltham Forest, has done some of the piloting around that with its Mini Holland program. But this is in Lambeth is explicitly as a response to the pandemic. And these are examples of the kind of opportunism that I saw coming out from some of the cities that I was visiting, that you look at existing programs, existing spends, existing initiatives, and ask yourself, how can you add a child-friendly layer to that? And what benefits will that bring? And I think the benefits are twofold. They're about reframing the conversation to be looking more at the collective and the long term, and to lift adults away from their narrow vested interests, and secondly, to improve the quality of the work that's carried out, because making places playful, making them places where we can linger, where families will want to spend time, actually makes places work better for all of us. That's the Enrique Peñalosa insight. So I'm going to close with a final, it's an open question. I was invited by Imi and her team to leave you with a question to ponder. And it's going back to the beginning of my talk and the kind of experiences you were reminding yourselves about, and to invite yourself to think about what you can do now to give today's children something like the same experiences that you enjoyed in your own childhood. So now I will stop. I think there might be a few seconds pause while various techie things happen that I don't understand, and then we will take up the conversation. Thank you.
Hi, Tim. Thank you so much for that. I wonder whether you could put those questions into the stage chat, if you can see it on the right. just as we go into the questions, because I think it'd be nice for people to answer them as we're going along.
So that last question that I asked.
Yeah, that would be really lovely, just so that people.
Okay.
And we'll start taking some questions. So I've got a bunch of questions ready for you as well.
Great.
And just while we're doing that, so at the end, I've got kind of a list of. This is for everyone in the audience. I've got a list of kind of interesting projects and schemes and things that are happening, and other things, as well as Tim's book, which will make sure you know where you can find out more about where to get it. So if you want to have a pen and paper with you, do at the end. And we've got some time for questions now. So I'm just going to go to the ones that are in the chat, and we'll get going. Okay, so we'll start going through the questions as they came in. So Tim, the first one is from Emily. It's a bit long, so just bear with me a second.
Sure.
As a mother of toddler twins, I agree with the need to address this. Should we also create places and spaces for people of all ages to connect, play, and participate? Social fabric, cohesion, and thriving people and places start with the places we live. With an aging population, should we be thinking about achieving this vision across the life course to promote cross-generational, cross-societal contact? Isn't this the foundation of building trust, happier, healthier people and places? So I'll hand over to you. I've got a few projects that I can signpost to around that life course work as well.
Thank you. Yeah, yes is the answer to that question. And if I'd had a bit longer, I would have talked about the need to move well away from this old sterile model of the play reservation. That what cities need are these compartmentalized spaces for children, and then we need a separate set of spaces for older people, and another set for dogs, and another set for office workers. That model, it emerged. The playground emerged as a response to the growth of traffic in cities, and if you like, an answer to the question, well, kids can't play in the street anymore, so where can they play? Answer in these dedicated play reservations. It's a broken model. I think growing numbers of cities are realizing that. Rotterdam, interestingly, has just a few years ago rewrote its guidance on place-based design, and is moving away from the playground and towards inclusive, age inclusive and inclusive in other ways spaces, and it's called Get Out. The translation is called Let's Get Outside. So there's just a basic wish. We all benefit if we spend time outside in public space together. Some of the audience may be familiar with the work of the NGO 880 Cities. So that's an international NGO, and it's called 880 Cities because its vision is that if you get a city to work well for an 8-year-old and for an 80-year-old, it will work well for everyone. And again, almost everything that I talked about in terms of child friendliness, being compact, walkable, green, sociable, is just as true for older people, especially once people lose the ability to drive, or if they've never had access to a car. It's just as true for that age demographic as it is for children. And so we are stronger when we come together with that inclusive vision. Of course, I want to make sure children's views and concerns are part of that mix. And let's remember that unlike older people, children don't vote. Children don't have a kind of automatic mandate to give their voice on changes in their neighborhood or in their city. So that is one important difference that makes me say, children's views and voices are particularly neglected. There are others as well. I think children's playfulness and their developmental need for contact and for space and time out of doors, is preeminent. And you can see that actually right now with the pandemic, with some of the consequences of children who are deprived of the opportunity to be out of doors, and some real problems as the lockdown starts to be eased, and some of the children who've had to spend months and months trapped indoors in cramped, difficult circumstances are having to are in a position of trying to rebuild their lives and their social lives. So I do think children have a particular claim for attention in this, but the inclusive vision of shared, diverse public space is one that I absolutely endorse.
Thanks so much, Tim. Yeah, I was going to say I came across the 8 to 80, and I do really love the idea of by centering children, you can create spaces that are safe and inclusive for many people. So moving on to the next question, and we'll share some of these projects at the end, so you can kind of like, if this talk has whet your appetite, you can go and see some more and start to see where there's experimentation and practice happening. But this is a good connection to the next question. This is from Emma Bierman, who is a lovely pioneer behind Playbox and so many other amazing things up in Leeds. Emma's asking, what does it take for the culture in the UK to care as much as, say, Holland, to address the lack of child literacy?
I mean, the Netherlands is, I think, exceptional. I can't claim to have done a systematic study, but it seems to be almost part of the Dutch stereotype that they are very they place a lot of importance, and a collective importance, on children. I mean, I would say let's see what we can learn from other countries that maybe are not quite, don't have that culture, but still recognise the role and importance of children, and that might be places like Germany, like Belgium. Belgium has a very active and impressive network on child-friendly cities. I guess I tend to accentuate the positive. I know I sometimes get frustrated when I read terrible stories about children being victimized or treated in hostile ways in public space, and that whole sort of children should be seen and not heard, or even not seen and not heard. I think there are enough examples in the UK of that go against that. So I think you've alluded to, and I know Emma's very involved in playing out and that movement to open up streets for children. And I think there are a few examples. Hackney is definitely one of a wider embracing of the idea of children having a more central role in civic and public life. Leeds is an example. Indeed, again, Emma will know of possibly one of the few cities that's maintained a focus on children's play at the municipal level, a strategic focus. So I think the short answer is we accentuate the positive in the UK. Oh, I should also say, and I should have said this in my talk, most frustrating, the lack of progress is most severe in England. There is good work happening in Wales and in Scotland around play, around children's rights, around mobility. The Welsh government has created a legal duty on municipalities to address children's play. In Scotland, there's some good work going on around the planning system. So I think in England, we'll find ourselves in a position where we're starting to point at work in Wales and Scotland, and using that as a way to start to build the case here. And I think those of us who've been working in the children's, broadly speaking, advocating for children over the last 5 or 10 years, it's been hard work in England. But I think, again, with the pandemic, we're beginning to see, chickens coming home to roost, and that if you have a government and a public policy discourse that ignores children, then it should be no surprise when children really start to fall through the cracks. So we have to start pointing out the problems with the current model and systems, whether that's about child and adolescent mental health, whether it's about the fiasco of schools reopening in England, and turn that into a positive and say, now's the time when we start to do better.
Thank you, Tim. There's an interesting reflection. Sorry, on the backstage, I can't see who it's from, but it's a nice reflection. It's not a question, but it's a good point to add it. I think it's Emma might have written, my kids are at the age where they could be roaming, but lockdown has definitely made that less likely, as they feel fearful of getting stopped out on their forays. I was going to pause there and say there's a whole conversation about for whom the public realm and which children for which it is safe to roam and to be playing. But I won't go into that right now. And she also goes on to say, but they are enjoying a digital social life, playing Minecraft, actually designing with kids from 7 to 14 about their ideal town. And she talks about like, how do we work where we are with kids in their context in a digital age, and recognize that they can play both at home and outside and have an imaginative response and influence planning, etc. I mean, on that point, I certainly know you weren't saying that indoor play is not good, but I was just going to ask, what do you think the impact of things like Minecraft and other games like that are having on children's imagination and how they city build? Is it that, because I'm hearing a lot about it, is this going to be a revolution? Is it that we've always had things like that, like Lego and other ways to imagine? I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that sort of trend that we're seeing in the digital way children are building cities.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's not a central focus of my work, but I can't avoid it. I mean, children's digital lives are incredibly important, and to a first approximation, I think children have an appetite for experience and an appetite for efficacy, for a sense of agency and social contact, and they will express that in whatever way they can. So for the last 20 or 30 years, we've actually been rearing children in effect in captivity to a much greater extent than we used to. So because children in the last decade or two have not been able to answer that appetite for experience IRL to the same extent that they used to, then they're doing it online, and that's been really clear to me from the off. And indeed, part of the explosive growth in our digital lives is precisely because, for many of us, but particularly for children, it's an arena, it's a medium, it's an ecosystem where they can recreate and reimagine their social lives, having been deprived of the opportunity to do that in the material world. So I'm, for the most part, neutral about technology. I think it can be a catalyst for children's engagement, for children's happiness, for children's well-being, and for children's learning. I am worried about the growth of the attention economy and the specific ways that social media I think in take over our lives, and I include myself sometimes in this, but especially younger children, in unhealthy ways. And I'm not saying that that's the biggest problem that's facing children now, but I do think that what I'm saying is I used to be pretty neutral about things like regulation of digital platforms. I now think there is more of a need for a close look at how children are using particularly social media, taking into account and understanding their lived experience. So not treating children as objects in a laboratory, but bringing in children's voices, but also having a good look at the harm that's being caused, which I think is significant around children's development. And I think that's partly around sort of unhealthy social and peer group interactions, but it's also just about very young children spending huge amounts of time and the opportunity cost of that. So the things that they're not doing because they're spending a lot of time on screen. So the short way of unpacking that is maybe starting to think in terms of good tech and bad tech. Now, that's really just a way of reframing the question rather than answering it. But I think that and what counts as good tech will be very different for different children of different ages in different contexts. But I think for me, that's helpful. And by the way, Sonia Livingston and her team at LSE are absolutely at the forefront of these sorts of debates, and I've long admired her work and would encourage anyone who's thinking about children's digital lives to check out her work.
Amazing, thank you. Yeah, I'll make sure we've got that on the list as well, so we can share it with the audience. So Rachel was asking, at the same time as creating child-friendly infrastructure in a city, there's probably going to be a lot of psychological work for parents and carers to understand the need for autonomy for children. Do you think municipalities are willing to consider this as part of working towards that change? I guess I'll add to that to say, you know, from the examples of where you're seeing it done well, are you seeing that that's also required in order to unlearn kind of so many things that the last few decades have taught us about, you know, children's agency and autonomy?
I think it varies. I think that sometimes that old principle that if you build it, they will come, it works. Not always, but sometimes. I mean, again, I think it's been really interesting to me to see how in many neighborhoods, the drop in traffic has led streets to become more visible, more vibrant and lively with children's play, even, you know, in the form of hopscotch and biking and scooting. So I think it will depend on context. I think that programming, to use a bit of a jargon word, can help to build up usage levels and confidence. I think that sort of meanwhile and pop-up sort of tactical urbanist type interventions that are a sort of mix of, you know, the hard or the physical and the social and programming can help. But I guess my vision is that we move towards our lighthouse, our direction of travel is that the neighborhoods that we build and the neighborhoods that we change physically, that building and that changing has got children's views and concerns threaded into it like a stick of rock, and that it's the physical fabric that is the main focus of my work, because that's what stays. Programming can fade, pop-up projects can and often are you know, time limited, but you know, once you build a street, it's pretty hard to change it. So we need to get these things right from the start, and we need to make smart changes when we do make changes.
Thank you for that. I think I know what you're probably going to say to this next question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, just in case there's some like interesting links that emerge. Because of the last talk, you know, arguably there's a whole host of shifts and changes in the cities that we live in that if we make will have an impact on children's lives. The example you use of air pollution, for example, and asthma, and actually recognizing the increased risk that that's creating and who's being disproportionately affected. This obviously will go on to have an impact on the lives children lead. It's probably something less obvious to children themselves, as opposed to, you know, streets with less cars and hopscotches. And so I'm just interested in how you think about this. And Gavita's question is quite a nice one to frame that. Do sustainable urban designs like cities such as Singapore or models like sustainable urban drainage contribute towards child friendliness?
Okay. The way I'm hearing that question, it's a sort of why am I just not kind of arguing for sustainable development, sustainable design, sustainable planning? And I think that's a really good question. And I sometimes think in terms of there's a big overlap, you know, but the overlap between let's make this neighborhood or this city sustainable and let's make this city child friendly. Let's say it's 80%. I mean, these are factoids, but there's a strong overlap, but it's not a total overlap. And also, I think that one of the biggest challenge I think that faces people who are arguing for any kind of progressive change in cities and neighborhoods is is building up a strong, well-supported public policy case, a moral case even. And so it's that this is a moral and political conversation, and I think that's where bringing children's voices and thinking about children can really help to elevate and stimulate that conversation. So even if the end result might look quite similar to what people who've been talking about sustainability have been saying, the way we get there, I think, is enhanced. We'll get there quicker, and we'll get to a better place if we bring in children's voices and a concern for children. So it's both of those things. It's thinking about involving and engaging children, and it's thinking about our adult responsibility to shape the world in ways that work for children. And I know I've sometimes had some spiky conversations with children's rights advocates who want to talk. Of course, we need to talk about children's participation, but I think we also need to talk about our adult responsibility for shaping neighbourhoods, and that, you know, we cannot expect children to be urban designers or strategic planners. We cannot expect them to have all the answers to these complex problems. We need to step up to the plate as adults and take some responsibility for the young generation and for future generations who are not even born yet. And so it's not either or, it's both and.
Thanks, Tim. I really appreciate that, because I think that's very much in the spirit of the festival. I really like you talking about the fact that we need to centre kind of children and their views in this. It's not actually about, you know, one silver bullet to solve everything. But I do also really enjoy the piece where you go on to say that we as adults need to take responsibility, because centering children's agency is really important and crucial to developing our streets, our neighbourhoods, etc. But actually, I have also noticed this kind of move where that can often allow adults to keep making decisions and keep designing cities and keep spending money and keep building in a way that is both inequitable, dangerous, not focused on play and children. And I think that the talk from last night from Roman Snarik about how to be a good ancestor really talks about that, and the activity he did where he got you to imagine your grandmother's 5th birthday and then your sort of child's 90th birthday, puts that into context, because, you know, we can't, it isn't any one of these things, right? If we put children at the center, that's going to do amazing things. But if we don't keep ourselves as adults accountable to the decisions we need to make and the things that need to happen and everything that needs to change in between that around children's governance and agency. And I'm really grateful that you framed that, because I've actually been thinking about this a lot these last few days, about how we're all a little bit right and how we're all a little bit wrong. And the Department of Dreams is really about weaving together as many ideas and as many expertise and practice and ideas to take that step forward. So yeah, let's it's not binary, but it's certainly incredibly important to make sure that we're centering children and childhood into design and children's voices in that. So I'm going to go to the last question I'm going to take from the audience before we start to wrap up. And while I read that last question out, I'm going to remind the audience that Tim's closing questions were: think about your own childhood and your memories of places and times where you felt free to play. What can you do? Think about that, and then what can you do to give children today a taste of that freedom? And it might be nice if any of you feel comfortable to share that in the stage chat so we can have a look later. If you don't, that's also fine. But that was Tim's closing kind of provocation. And then Deborah, Deborah's got one last question. We know Deborah well. She's a really wonderful lady who lives in Birmingham, who's doing a PhD now in women in planning. And she said she really enjoyed your talk. And she was asking, could you speak to the effects of gender influence and on space, and in turn how this affects play, children? Have you got any insights into that? That would be lovely.
Sure. So I hear that as in two parts. One, there's the sort of girls versus boys question, and then there's a sort of gendered perspective on planning question. So take the first point first. There are clear differences between girls and boys' use of public space, and particularly older. When I say older, I mean it varies, but 7, 8, 9, 10 upwards. Below that age, girls and boys, their patterns of use and are reasonably similar. I mean, from what we can see from the research. But then after that sort of age, girls tend to be less visible, less active, less outdoors, and I think there are gendered reasons why that's happening, and around, you know, perhaps to the extent that public space, children's needs are given any thought in public space, it's often boys, you know, football courts or skateboarding or whatever, you know, they're quite gendered activities, and there's been some good work on that in a few places. Vienna, which is one example, did some interesting work around working with girls to find out their views on public space and how public space could be improved. And it kind of leads into the second half of that question, which is that work was partly driven by, I think it was a deputy mayor in Vienna, or possibly one of the senior planners, or possibly both, you know, who were women, who you know, were reacting against a planning process or a planning discourse that is not very concerned about other, you know, people other than economically active, commuting, often car driving people who tend to be male, and of course the decision makers often tend to be male as well. So I think there are some. It certainly strikes me that some of the people whose work I'm following closely are women involved in particularly transport. I think there's some amazing female transport engineers and thinkers out there, both here in the UK and overseas, in NACTO, the National Association of City Transportation Officials, which is a New York-based organisation, I think. Anyhow, it's doing some terrific work on street design. It's just about to publish a book called Streets for Kids. And there's some really smart female planners, urban designers, transport, highways people helping to shape that work. And so I'm hopeful that that's going to bear fruit.
Thank you so much, Tim. There's some things coming into the chat and recommendations you're making to people's work, and people are sort of supporting each other with some links. So please do go on to have a look at some of those. I want to say thank you so much to Tim for his time today, and for the ideas and principles that he's laid out, and particularly the book, and continuing to fight for, you know, children at the centre of cities and how that could be so transformative. Given that lots of you know that as an organisation over the last 5 or 6 years, through Amy Martin, we've done quite a lot of work around childcare and childhood, and been testing lots of things and building practical prototypes and other things. So I'm going to leave you with some sort of things to follow up and check if you're interested in projects that are interesting and exciting. And first of all, I'm going to start by saying Tim has got a book out that will be published by Reba. He's on Twitter as Tim R. Gill, and you can follow him there and check out his book and purchase it from a good independent when it's published. And yeah, such a great talk, and follow each other's links. And so just to kind of round up really. So we started to wander into gender and its role in childhood and play and planning. I know that one of our team members, Danny, aka Zaz, you might have come across them, is looking and doing a lot of research on gender and childhood and what it means to be beyond the binary of male and female when you're a child, and what that looks like. And they've been doing lots of research. So I think there's going to be a blog soon about that coming out through Radical Childcare Babhouse. So look out for that from Zaz and Amy. Talking about some of the stuff that Tim mentioned around play sufficiency and legislating for play. Ludicology in Wales are a great link on that. They've done some incredible work, as Tim says, to actually legislate for play and move forward with that. I don't know much about the Scotland planning scenario, so maybe Tim can drop some links on his Twitter. I would encourage following Playing Out, that are doing lots of work on play streets and have pioneered that, and maybe testing that in your area. 8 to 80 is another great project, and Urban 95. And we'll share a list of this as well, probably in the chat or on our Twitter. A shout out to Emma Bierman, who's here as well, Playbox and Playful Anywhere, pioneer and just absolutely gorgeous advocate for children's play as well. Roam here in Birmingham's looking at children's right to roam. It's on, all of these things are also on Twitter. Sam Williams, if you're not quite patient enough to wait for Tim's book, Sam Williams has got like a tactical guide to how to start to implement child-friendly cities in different ways. It's just a little pamphlet, so you can, well, it's not just a little pamphlet, it's a very useful pamphlet, but what I mean is it's not a huge book, you can just download it online. One of Dan Hill's papers is From Slow Down to Playground. You've just heard from Dan Hill, so check that out. Dan's done a lot of great work in urban design. Participatory City down in Barking and Dagenham, another good one. Tomorrow, not child-centred entirely, but very much around participatory cities, and their Tomorrow Today Streets is doing lots of work with children as well, but they've also got an incredible children's programme that's been emerging. And of course, if you fancy it, you can go back and check our work on Radical Childcare out. You can follow Amy, Roselle, Martin on Twitter, hashtag Radical Childcare, or the next phase of that at Babhouse, which will be coming alongside and as part of Civic Square later this year. So hopefully all of that beautiful conversation and information and research and the book and ideas from Tim, combined with lots of things you can go and follow up on, have given you lots of food for thought. And to leave you with that final question, which is, what does it mean for you to enable a child to have a taste of freedom today? And maybe if you do something like that, share it with us on Twitter or show us what's going on. Thank you so much. And I'm going to unmute Tim now so he can say bye as well. Thanks so much to Tim for all your time. It's been really wonderful to have you with us.
Well, thank you, Amy, and thanks. It's been amazing achievement to set all this up, and I just hope it reaches beyond the small screen that I'm looking at and leaves some seeds that can grow, because it's, you know, now it's an extraordinary time, even though it's a very challenging time, and you know, things are going to change.